The credit report printed at 11:52 on a Tuesday night, and I sat at my kitchen table for a long time before I let myself read all the way down the page. I was 23 years old. I was renting a one-bedroom apartment on the third floor of a building in Columbus, Ohio, that smelled like old wood and other people's cooking, and I had a copper kettle I had bought at a thrift store for $4 because it made the place feel like mine. I had a small framed certificate from my medical billing course on the wall above the stove. I had a standing lamp I had carried up 3 flights of stairs by myself the weekend I moved in. I had a navy wool coat with the missing third button hanging on the back of the door. And I had a handwritten ledger in the kitchen drawer that contained, in careful columns I updated every Sunday evening, every dollar I had earned and spent and saved since I was 16 years old. The credit report showed 3 open lines of credit I had never applied for. The oldest dated back 4 years. My name on every one. Spelled correctly in full. Combined balance, $23,417. I folded the page once. I set it under the copper kettle. I went to bed. I did not sleep. My father's name is Gerald Kowalski. He is 58 years old, and the thing that I think is most important to understand about him before I tell you the rest of this is that he was never the kind of man who made it easy to name what he was doing. He did not raise his voice. He did not break things. He did not fit the shape that people imagine when they imagine a harmful parent. What he did instead was quieter and more structural. He had spent his entire life arranging the world so that whatever went wrong and it was traceable back to someone else's failure. A decision someone else had made. A moment where the people around him had been, as he liked to say, selfish. My mother left when I was 11. I have thought about that many times over the years, and I have settled somewhere around the conclusion that she was doing what people do when they have spent everything they have, and there is nothing left to spend. My brother Dennis was 6 years older than me, and he left for Pittsburgh at 17 to live with our mother's sister, and I do not fault him for that either. But it meant that from the time I was 14, the house on Fairchild Avenue was just me and my father. Just the two of us, in the particular quiet of a house organized entirely around one person's comfort and needs. I started working at 16, not because I legally had to, but because money gave me a small, portable form of independence that nothing else did. I paid for my own bus pass. I paid for my own school supplies starting in 10th grade. I kept the handwritten ledger as a record of the fact that what was mine, and I could account for every dollar of it, which was a kind of security my childhood had never offered me in any other form. My father worked in facilities maintenance. He was steady in good stretches and unreliable in difficult ones, and there was no reliable way to predict which you were going to get. When I was 19, the calls started. I was working 28 hours a week at a diner and taking 2 evening courses at the community college, and the calls came in a rhythm I recognized immediately. Start with how things were fine. Drift into how things were complicated. Arrive at a specific number with a specific reason attached. The furnace needed a part that the building wasn't covering. The car registration was due. The utility bill had gotten away from him this month. A thing at work had gone sideways in a way that wasn't his fault and had cost him 2 weeks of shifts. The first time I sent money, I was standing in the diner parking lot after a closing shift, still wearing my apron, and I transferred $200 from my savings account to his. It was October. The air smelled like leaves and exhaust. I told myself it was a one-time thing. It was not a one-time thing. By my 21st birthday, the transfers had become a routine, and by my 22nd they had become, in some part of my understanding I had not yet examined, a cost of belonging. Something I paid so that I could keep believing that what I had was a difficult but functioning family rather than something else entirely. Over 4 years, I sent my father a total of $14,811. I know the exact number because I kept the ledger. I updated it every Sunday. I recorded every transfer, the date, the amount, the reason he had given when he called. I was not keeping it as evidence. I was keeping it the way I kept everything, because I had grown up in a house where money moved in untraceable ways, and I had made myself a promise, young, that mine would always be traceable. I never asked him to repay any of it. I want to be honest about that, and about why. Part of it was genuine love, The kind that forms in children who are the last one left in a diminished household, and who carry the weight of that without being asked. Part of it was the lesson I had absorbed over years of small, repeated moments that asking for things back was a form of selfishness, and selfishness was the worst thing you could be in this family. And part of it was that I had not yet learned to see the difference between helping someone and funding someone's sustained refusal to help themselves. Those are not the same thing. I know that now. What I had never done, and I need to be clear about this, was give my father permission to open 3 lines of credit in my name while I was sending him that money every month. To use my social security number and my address as instruments. To charge $23,000 to accounts I did not know existed, while accepting my transfers and thanking me for being there for him. I called the credit bureau at 7:14 the next morning, 20 minutes before my shift at the medical billing office began. The woman who answered walked me through the dispute process in a voice that was calm and practiced and professionally kind in the way of people who do difficult work with the public every day. She told me I would need to file a police report. I would need to contact each of the 3 creditors individually. I would need to document everything and be prepared for a process that could take 3 to 6 months. I wrote all of it down in the ledger. Then I got on the bus and went to work. I want to tell you something about those first days, because they matter to understanding what came after. On the surface, nothing changed. I sat across from my supervisor Renata Bellamy at the billing office and processed claims and answered phones and ate lunch at my desk on Tuesdays and Thursdays because the break room got crowded and I needed the quiet. I came home. I boiled water in the copper kettle. I made Earl Grey tea from the dented tin on the second shelf. I updated the ledger. But underneath that, I was beginning to build something. Not out of anger. Out of the same careful, patient habit that had made me keep the ledger in the first place. There was also a voicemail on my phone I had not yet returned. Patricia Vance, senior claims investigator, had called 2 days before the credit report arrived. She was calling regarding a homeowner's insurance claim filed under my name in connection with my current address. The requested payout was $6,240. Water damage. The policy was attached to my social security number. She said she would like to speak with me at my earliest convenience. I returned her call on Thursday of that week from my car in the parking structure outside my building, with the receipt for the police filing fee on the passenger seat and the ledger open on my knee. Patricia's voice was crisp and efficient. She said the claim had been filed 8 weeks earlier. She said she had documentation connecting my address to several accounts she would like to ask me about. I told her Thursday the following week at 2 o'clock worked. She said that was fine. My father showed up at my apartment at 6:47 the following Saturday morning. He did not call first. He never called first. He said advance notice felt formal, and formality was for strangers. He was wearing his brown jacket, the one he had owned since I was 15, and he was carrying a paper bag from the donut shop 2 blocks from my building, and he smiled when I opened the door, the wide, easy smile that had always preceded a version of a conversation I did not choose. I let him in. I made him coffee. I sat down across from him and let him talk. He talked about his week, his neighbor's car, a situation at work. He was good at filling a room with words that created the sensation of warmth without actually requiring him to be present in any real way. I had been receiving that sensation my whole life and mistaking it for connection. When he stopped talking, I said, I pulled my credit report. He looked at me. 3 accounts, I said. For years. $23,000. He was quiet for a moment. Then he set down his mug and said, You owe this family. Stop acting like a stranger every time things get difficult. I held my tea. I looked at him. I did not respond. That sentence had lived in his vocabulary for as long as I could remember. You owe this family. Not an explanation. Not a denial. Not even a deflection. Just the reminder that I carried a debt that predated any dollar amount, that was not subject to audit, and that would never be paid off. I had been hearing it my whole life. I had been paying against it for 4 years, and the balance had never moved. He talked for another 35 minutes. He offered explanations without apologies. He talked around the accounts. He left when I stopped responding to him. I washed both cups. I put the donuts in the refrigerator. I sat back down at the table. I did not cry. I did not call him back. I opened the ledger, and I made a note of the date and the time and what he had said. The police report took 40 minutes to file. The officer who took my statement was a deputy named Sheriff, matter-of-fact and unhurried, who asked me whether I knew who had opened the accounts and wrote down my answer in the same tone she would have used for a parking complaint. I told her I had a strong belief about who was responsible. She told me I would receive a case number by mail within 5 to 7 business days. I drove home from the precinct in the early afternoon, the receipt for the filing fee on the passenger seat, the windows down because it was one of those March days in Columbus where the air is cold but the sun is real. I had 3 more phone calls to make that week, to each of the 3 creditors, and I had a folder I had labeled with a strip of masking tape that said Kowalski accounts, the first time I had written my own surname on something with that particular feeling of being on the opposite side of it. Renata noticed something that week, though she did not say so directly. On Wednesday morning, she set a cup of coffee on my desk without being asked and said, "You're getting through a lot of work this week." I said I had a project I was trying to stay focused on at home, and she nodded and did not press. That was one of the things I respected most about Renata. She was not incurious. She simply understood the difference between noticing and asking. I made the first creditor call on Monday evening, the second on Wednesday, the third on Friday. Each conversation was long and involved hold music and being transferred twice and having to repeat my name and social security number to multiple people in a row, which had a particular kind of exhausting quality that I don't know how to describe except to say it is the exhaustion of having to prove that your own life belongs to you. Each representative opened a dispute. Each one told me I would need to submit the police report case number in writing. I wrote the confirmation numbers in the ledger alongside the representative's name, the time of the call, and the exact phrases they had used that indicated the dispute was formally opened. I also called Dennis on a Wednesday evening that week, not the Wednesday I called him from the bathroom floor. That came later, but an earlier, quieter call. I told him I had something going on with Dad. I told him what I had found on the credit report. Dennis was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "How long?" And I told him 4 years. He made a sound I recognized, not anger exactly, more like recognition of something he had suspected for a long time and had not let himself fully form into a thought. "What are you going to do?" he said. "I already started," I said. He said, "Good." That was all. It was enough. There is something important about having one person in the world who has known the same house you grew up in and who does not require you to explain the architecture of it. Dennis and I had not been close in the years since he left. We talked every few weeks, we showed up for each other at a distance, but in that phone call I felt him show up in a different way, and I held on to that. The community college library was open until 10 on weeknights. On Tuesday of the following week, I went back for the first time since finishing my certification, and I sat in the same chair under the same low yellow lamp I had used 2 years earlier when I was studying for my final exam, and I spent 90 minutes reading about identity theft resolution processes and financial fraud civil recourse. I needed to understand exactly what had been done to me in precise legal language, because I had learned from growing up in my father's house that the person who controls the language of a situation controls the situation. I was not going to walk into Thursday's conversation with Patricia Vance without knowing the exact terms that applied to what she was investigating. It was the night before Thursday, when things got hard. I was lying on the bathroom floor at 1:30 in the morning. The tile was cold against my back, and I had not been able to sleep for 2 hours, and I had finally given up and gone in there because the cold was the most honest sensation available. I was staring at the ceiling and running through everything I knew, the 3 accounts, the insurance claim, the 4 years, the $14,811 I had sent voluntarily on top of the money he had taken without asking, and I was trying to build a complete picture of it, and every time I thought I had it held together it would shift slightly, and I would see a new corner of it I had not accounted for. What I was afraid of, I realized at some point between 1:30 and 2 o'clock, was not my father. I had been living with the reality of who my father was for a long time. What I was afraid of was the story getting turned around. It always got turned around in my family. My mother leaving became my mother abandoning. Dennis leaving became Dennis being ungrateful. Every act of self-preservation in that house got translated, in my father's retelling, into a form of attack on him. I was afraid that I would do everything correctly and end up in the version that circulated among the few relatives who were left, as the daughter who had betrayed her father when he needed her most. I turned that fear over for a while. I held it and looked at it. Then I picked up my phone and called Dennis. He answered on the third ring, groggy but not annoyed. I told him where I was. I told him what I was afraid of. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, in the kind of voice that does not allow for argument, "You filed the report. You called them back. You have the ledger. You did everything right. You are a victim in this situation, Nadia, not a participant." "I know that technically," I said. "Not technically," he said. "Actually, I know how Dad tells stories. But you have a paper trail that goes back 4 years. A story is not the same as a ledger." I stayed on the bathroom floor for another few minutes after he hung up. Then I got up. I washed my face. I drank a glass of water. I went back to bed, and I lay there looking at the ceiling, and slowly, gradually, something in my chest began to settle. I was not responsible for what he had done. I was responsible for what I did next. Those were the only numbers that were mine. I slept. Thursday arrived the way days do when you have been waiting for them, by being suddenly just the present moment, the morning light coming through the kitchen window, the copper kettle heating on the stove, the green folder of documents on the table beside my coffee. My father called at noon. He said he was in the neighborhood and wanted to stop by. He said it casually, the way he said everything, in the tone of a man who had never in his life considered that his presence might not be wanted. I told him I had someone coming at 2. He said he would just stay for a bit. I want to be honest about the decision I made in that moment because people have asked me about it since, in the way people ask about choices they are trying to understand. I did not tell him to stay away. I did not tell him what was coming. I had thought about it. I had thought about it for days, actually. I had drafted in my head a version of the afternoon where I called him and told him not to come, where I kept the two things cleanly separated. But somewhere in those days of drafting and discarding that version, I had arrived at a different position. I was not staging anything. I was not trying to engineer a confrontation. What I had decided, quietly and without drama, was that I was not going to actively prevent two truths from occupying the same room if they arrived there on their own. My father was one truth. Patricia Vance and her folder were another. They did not need me to arrange them. I let him in at 1:45. I made him coffee. He sat at the table and talked. I sat across from him and listened, or made the sounds of listening, and I drank my tea, and at 2:03 exactly there were 3 knocks at the door. Patricia Vance shook my hand and introduced herself in full and handed me a card. She had a gray blazer and a leather satchel and the kind of calm, deliberate manner that belongs to people who do careful, serious work without any interest in performing it. She glanced at my father when she came in, a quick professional assessment, and then looked at me. "Is this a bad time?" she said. "No," I said. "Please come in." She set her satchel on my kitchen table and opened it and took out a folder. She asked me to confirm my full name, my current address, and my social security number, which I did. She asked whether I had filed the homeowner's insurance claim referenced in her letter. "No," I said. "I did not file that claim." She asked if I had any information about who might have filed it. I told her I had filed a police report 10 days prior regarding fraudulent accounts opened in my name and that I could provide the case number. She wrote that down. She asked for the case number, and I read it to her from my phone. Then she looked across the table at my father. "Sir," she said, "I need to ask you directly. Have you been using this address as a mailing address for any financial correspondence or insurance accounts?" My father's hands were around his coffee mug. He said, "I visit my daughter sometimes." "Are you listed as a resident at this address, or have you used this address as your address of record for any financial accounts, insurance policies, or credit applications?" He said nothing. "I have documentation," Patricia said in the same even tone, connecting this address to several accounts and a recent insurance claim. "The social security number attached to those accounts belongs to your daughter. I would like to ask you some questions, and I want to let you know that you are not required to answer them, but that anything you tell me may be used in our investigation." My father looked at me. It was the first time since she had walked in that he looked directly at me, and I want to describe what was in that look accurately because it was not what I expected. I had expected anger. What I saw instead was something that looked, briefly, like the face of a person who had just arrived at the end of a long road they had thought had more distance left in it. Something that had been suspended, held in place by forward motion, suddenly stopping. I looked back at him. I did not say anything. The folder was on my table. The ledger was on my counter. The police case number was in my phone. Dennis knew everything I knew. I had not done a single dramatic thing in the 3 weeks since the credit report printed. I had kept paper. I had made phone calls. I had opened my door when people knocked. My father put down his coffee mug. He went completely still. Patricia stayed for an hour and 22 minutes. She was thorough and unhurried. She asked me to walk her through my knowledge of each account, the first time I had become aware of them, my contact with the creditors, the dispute status of each. I told her. She asked about the insurance claim, the policy number, the date filed, whether I had any correspondence connected to it. I showed her the letter she had sent to my address. She photographed it. Then I gave her the ledger. I turned it to the page for January 4 years ago and set it in front of her, and she looked at it for a long moment. The columns. Every date. Every transfer amount. Every notation of what my father had said when he called to ask. For years of a Sunday evening record of a transaction I had thought was generosity. You kept all of this, she said. I keep everything, I said. She photographed 14 pages of the ledger. She asked for the names and account numbers of my 3 creditors. She confirmed the police report case number a second time. She told me her company would be referring the matter to their fraud division and that the county financial crimes unit had an open report that would likely be connected to her investigation. She thanked me for my cooperation and told me I would be contacted by both her company and the county unit within 30 days. My father answered her questions in short sentences. He said he had used my address for some correspondence because it was more reliable than his current situation. He said it had not been intended to harm me. He said things had been very difficult. He said this looking at the table, not at Patricia, not at me. She wrote everything down in the same steady way she wrote everything else, without reaction. When she packed her satchel to leave, she shook my hand again and held it for just a moment longer than a standard handshake. You should hear from us within 30 days, she said. If you have any questions, you have my card. After the door closed, my father did not move for a moment. Then he stood up slowly, the way men stand when their body is doing it before their mind has decided to. He looked around the apartment. The copper kettle on the stove. The framed certificate. The standing lamp. He looked at those things the way you look at a room when you are finally seeing it as it is rather than as what you needed it to be. Nadia, he said. You should go, I said. He started to say something. I watched 3 or 4 things move across his face. None of them new. All of them familiar. He had been running versions of them my whole life. Finally, he said, I needed help. I didn't know how to ask. You asked me every time you called, I said. You called me every time you needed money, and I sent it. You had my phone number for 4 years. He left. I stood at the window. His car sat in the parking lot for 9 full minutes before it moved. I watched the taillights disappear at the lot exit, and then I went to the table, and I picked up the ledger, and I held it for a moment. Family without respect becomes entitlement, and entitlement grows teeth the moment you build something it cannot control. I had built something small. A certificate on a wall. A kettle from a thrift store. A column of numbers that could not be argued with. But it was entirely mine. Dennis drove down from Pittsburgh the following weekend. He texted the night before to say he was coming, which was not something he had done before in all the years since he had left the house on Fairchild Avenue, and which told me more about how seriously he was taking this than anything he had said on the phone. He slept on the pull-out sofa. We ordered from the Thai place on the corner. I spread the ledger on the kitchen table, and we sat with it for a long time, longer than I expected, turning pages. He did not say very much for the first 20 minutes. He just read. All 4 years, he said finally. All 4 years, I said. And the whole time he was also. Yes, I said. He put the ledger down and sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, which is something he has done since he was a kid when he is working something out. Then he looked at me. You kept every page, he said. I always kept everything, I said. He nodded slowly. Then he said, I should have been around more. And I said, you were surviving. Surviving sometimes looks like leaving. And he looked at me for a moment in a way that told me he had been carrying some version of that particular guilt for years, and that having it named directly and without accusation did something for him that he had not expected. We ate the food. We talked for a long time, not only about my father, about his job, about the apartment he was looking at, about a trip he was thinking of taking. It was the most I had talked to my brother in several years, and somewhere in the middle of it I realized that the thing my father had built with his way of operating, the isolation, the depletion, the quiet cost of being in his orbit, had kept Dennis and me at a distance from each other too, in the years since he left. Not because we had wanted to be, because we had both been spending our energy elsewhere. The formal fraud investigation opened 6 weeks after Patricia's visit. I received a letter identifying me as a victim witness in the case, and I stood at my kitchen counter and read it twice, and then filed it in the green folder alongside the original credit report and the police case documentation and the copies of my creditor correspondence. Then I went to work. My father called 11 times in the 2 weeks after Patricia had come. I let every call go to voicemail. He left 4 messages. The first message, left the Monday after Patricia's visit, was about humiliation. He said I had humiliated him. He said I had not given him any chance to address the situation before bringing outside people into it. He said this was typical of how I had always handled conflict in the family, which was to escalate without warning. The second message, left Thursday of that week, was about context. He said I did not understand what his financial situation had actually been during those years. He said if I had asked him, he would have explained it. He said he had never intended for any of it to affect my credit. The third message, left the following Monday, was about me. It was a longer version of the sentence he had said at my kitchen table, that I owed this family, that I had always made things harder than they needed to be, that he had given up a lot for me, and he had hoped I would be the one who understood that. I listened to all 3 on the same evening, sitting in my kitchen with my tea, letting each one play through to the end. The fourth message came on a Sunday evening, 9 days after the third. It was different from the others. It was just his voice saying my name twice. Then a long pause. Then the line ending. No argument. No explanation. No version of the accounting he usually ran. Just my name, and then silence, and then nothing. I listened to it twice. I did not call back. I have had time now to understand something about my father that I could not see clearly from inside those years. He grew up in a house where money was the only legible form of power, and power was the only legible form of safety, and the way you maintained safety was by ensuring that the people around you needed you more than you needed them. He was not taught any other language. He went his entire adult life taking from whoever was closest and naming it obligation, using without acknowledging, framing every act of accountability directed at him as an act of aggression against him, because that was the grammar of the house he came from, and he had never once stopped to ask whether it had to keep going. He was not a monster. He was a person who had been damaged in particular ways and had passed that damage forward without noticing, because noticing would have required him to stop, and stopping would have required him to feel something about what he had done, and he had spent his whole life building structures to prevent exactly that. That does not make any of it acceptable. Understanding a wound does not mean agreeing to keep receiving it. And compassion is not a key to my front door. I applied for the claims supervisor position at the billing office that same month. Renata had told me it was opening up 3 weeks before Patricia's visit, in a casual way that was not casual at all. Renata never mentioned things casually. She mentioned things at the right time and let you do what you were going to do with them. I sat at my kitchen table on a Tuesday evening with the lamp on and the Earl Grey tin beside me, and I wrote the application in one draft. I knew what I had built, and I knew how to describe it. I got the position 4 weeks later. Renata called me into her office and told me without a lot of ceremony the way she did most things, and I thanked her and went back to my desk and sat for a moment before I did anything else. I thought about the framed certificate on my kitchen wall, the one I had carried from the community college to this apartment 3 years ago. I thought about the 16-year-old who had started keeping a ledger because she needed one thing in her life she could account for completely. I called Dennis on the way home. He said, "I knew it." I said, "I didn't." He laughed. It has been 14 months since Patricia Vance sat at my kitchen table with her folder. The 3 fraudulent accounts have been removed from my credit file. The cleanup took 5 months and more paperwork than I could have imagined, and when it was done my credit score was higher than it had ever been. I moved to a larger apartment in April. I took the copper kettle, the framed certificate, the standing lamp with the sticky switch, and the ledger. Dennis calls on Sunday evenings now. It has become a thing we do. He asked me once if I missed my father, and I sat with the question for a while before I answered. I said I missed the idea of what he could have been. The father that the warmth in his voice had always seemed to be promising, the one who had never quite materialized. Dennis said he understood. We let that sit between us for a moment, and then he asked what I wanted for my birthday, and we moved on. I am 24 years old. I have a promotion and a clean file, and a ledger that goes only forward from here. Some people only know how to love what they can control. When you stop being controllable, that love tends to reveal what it was actually made of. Choosing not to be controlled is not cruelty. It is not ingratitude. It is the beginning of your own life. Forgiveness is not access. Understanding is not reunion. Real family does not test whether you can survive without them. And the first person who needs to know you are done shrinking is not the person who shrank you. It is you. I think about the 4th voicemail sometimes. My name, twice, and then nothing, and then the call ending. I have made a decision not to fill in the silence he left there. Whatever he was going to say, it was another version of a conversation I had been having since I was 14 years old, and I was done paying the entry fee. The cost of keeping peace in a house, where peace means being the smallest person in the room, is your whole life. I was 23 when I decided mine was worth more than that. I keep the ledger on my kitchen counter. Not because I am tracking anything from before. Just because it is a record of the fact that I was always paying attention, even when I was 19 and sending the transfers and calling it love. I was writing it down. I was keeping the pages. And when the time came, I had every single one. If the people who raised you taught you that love is measured by how much of yourself you are willing to carry for someone else, if they told you that asking to be treated fairly is the same as being selfish, I want to ask you something. Not to make you angry, and not to make you sad. Who gave you that arithmetic? And is it time to start keeping your own numbers?